And welcome to Funnel Lab Fridays. Funnel Lab Fridays is a weekly LinkedIn live session where we dive into use cases and challenges for data savvy marketers. I'm your host, Eric Westerkamp, CEO of CaliberMind. And today I have Misha Salkinder and Doug Bell, also of CaliberMind, joining me today. Real quick, Doug and Misha, you've been on, but maybe just a quick intro and kind of your role here at CaliberMind.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Misha.
I'm a director of customer data strategy. I get to work with a lot of our customers and spend a lot of time thinking on the intersection of data and marketing analytics.
I run marketing, and I would bet I'm probably one of the heaviest users of our tools. I've been around marketing for 25 years, and this is the third time I've worked with an organization that is trying to crack the attribution nut. So that's my background.
Awesome. So today we're going to be focusing entirely on some new capabilities that we've released in the CaliberMind platform. And we're going to be discussing the combination of intent data and AI, specifically generative AI, and how they can benefit customers that are kind of really trying to understand their buyer journeys. So real quick, Doug, why do you think this is kind of meaningful for customers and for our customers and also for the kind of the market broadly?
Okay, so two primary use cases will be brief. The first is, we are as marketers quite often swimming in data, and that's part of our job. But the ability to take a vast amount of data and have that summarized and simplified, that's incredibly useful. But I think the primary use case I'm seeing out there for us is, we've got busy sales organizations who don't have the time to go through and divine from mass amounts of information who the buying unit is, or who the most important person in the buying unit is, or when to strike when there's something working its way through the system that they should address. Let's say that's a lead or an activity. That's where I see this as being probably the most meaningful.
And if I could just add, I think that with that personalization as well, right? So the idea to deliver the next right action given a certain buyer journey, certain experiences, showing specific motions around certain products can really help make the next motion be more successful, right? So yes, on one hand, limited amount of time and needing to reach out to as many prospects as possible in a short period of time, but also make that outreach be meaningful, where translating perhaps a table of signals into something that's easily digestible becomes very important.
Yeah. And we're going to switch things up a little bit today. What we're going to do is we're actually going to jump real quick into a demo and then talk about that demo and kind of what why is this powerful? And then why is it also hard for customers to kind of actually do and actually build themselves? And from that perspective, let me just kind of jump right in real quick. And I'm going to show you guys, I'm in CaliberMind. And what I'm going to show real quick is we're pulling in intent data. And in this case, we're pulling in intent data from streams coming in from G2 and also Bombora, where we can actually directly integrate a lot of this Bombora intent right into our engagement platform. But one of the challenges companies have is that you see all of these different topics. Here we got surging topics, right? And you can see here where I've got these surge scores are generating intent around literally thousands of companies for these different search scores. And this is for us. When we deploy this for our customers, we see tens of thousands of companies showing up here, right? So a lot of really good information, but it's also very, what do you do with this? Like, it's difficult to use and action on, right? And so when you then reduce this down to an organization, I'm going to look at a very specific company here. I'm looking at Experian. And what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, now I'm going to look at a buyer journey for this company. And you can see, here's a lot of engagement that's been surging. But what you can see here is those intent scores kind of popping up here, G2 ads, surging again later on in time, kind of moving down. We're seeing hitting the website, coming into drift, a lot of sales engagement. Like, this is gold. I mean, this is the buyer journey, right? But the challenge we've seen is this is great, Doug, for you, right? As a CMO to really dig into all the details, or Misha as a data scientist for you to kind of see what's going on. But how does a BDR use this? how does an SDR or an AE use this information? Like, what good is this, right? And so the real power is when you can combine the intent data with the first party data, to your point, Misha, and then be able to kind of figure out how to summarize it. And that's where something like this really comes into play. We're taking intent, we're taking first party, we're actually then running them through, generative AI models to summarize this information in a way that can then be leveraged by your sales team or your CS organization, right? How do I'm translating all that data, all that gold into something they can really use, right? And Misha, I know that you're kind of out there on the front line starting to deploy this to organizations and things like that. But what are you seeing as far as like how they're starting to use this and how they're trying to leverage it?
Yeah, I think these summaries have made the data much more accessible. While previously we got this notion of, yeah, this is amazing, but we need to have a translation layer, typically through the lens of a marketing analyst to enable sales. We now are seeing sales organizations using the granularity of the data in this format to actually action their next steps. So previously the focus was on understanding which organizations are engaged through a cumulative engagement score. We've even seen organizations adopt an engagement score specific to third-party engagement, which I think is a really neat motion. But now I think we're seeing this data actually being actioned, right? Where you're able to, zoom into an account, and it's not only how engaged is account X relative to account Y, it is, like we mentioned earlier, how are they engaged? Have they visited certain elements of the website? Are they showing signals that I can subsequently mention in my next communication with them? Is there a preferred method of communication, for example, as well?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things, so this model of intent plus first party and getting it into a summarization is really powerful. But one of the things that we've noticed is that the road from those data signals to that summary is actually really complicated, right? And so something I want to kind of share here is a quick kind of overview of what it really takes to do some of these things, right? So very powerful. You're trying to generate these outcomes, but what does it take to get here, right? And just to kind of set the context, like marketing has a kind of a problem. They're becoming like sort of the owner, shall we say, of the buyer journey, right? So marketing, they have all these data sources. They're becoming the owner, right? But that buyer journey is only helpful if you understand it and you can action on it, right? So how does marketing help all the rest of the organization do things with it? So you think about it, you've got like tons of data sources, right? First party data, ad platforms, intent data, data coming from SalesLoft, Outreach, Gong, other. I mean, Misha, for our customers, like what's the average number of like platforms that they tend to deal with and bring data into our system?
Yeah, probably from as few as 6 to as many as, I would say, 20, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, imagine 20 different platforms data, right? So you
And
got all
that
this
excludes bespoke, the random attendee list from a conference that comes from a Google sheet somebody forgot to upload.
Yeah, exactly. So you got all this data, right? What do you do with it, right? Because the goal is like, what we're seeing as a lot of companies is like they take that data and they put it into a data warehouse. What have you seen as the challenges for companies? Like we've taken over a lot of projects where they've done this part, like they got this part done, right? But then what, right? So what have you seen as some of the challenges, Misha or Doug, even, as organizations that kind of got to this point, they got all that data sitting in the data warehouse, but they're trying to action on
it? The data is often still siloed. So just because you were able to place it all in data warehouse, they're still separate entities, meaning that the process of creating a unified event timeline is still very challenging because it requires normalization. Different systems have different fields for, let's say, a notion of a type or of a specific motion. And then subsequently, you have to recreate the actual entity relationships between these. So in order to understand, right, let's say you have an entity that are organizations, and then you have another entity that are certain actions, you might need to use parameters from organizations with the actions in order to say these patterns by these types of organizations are being seen in the data, right? So you have to join these together, and that is not so easy to be done when some events are not sitting in the same platform as, let's say, your accounts themselves, right?
Yeah.
So there still needs to be a kind of a fixing and normalizing the data in order to be able to unify it.
Right.
Yeah, and from a user experience standpoint, Misha's absolutely nailed it. But from a user experience standpoint, quite often what you get is, a BI application on top of poorly or extremely well parsed data that's not related well. And you find yourself thinking through the data from a data key standpoint, which is not what you want your head of marketing doing, right? You want them to be able to get those answers really quickly. And this process itself is incredibly hard.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that we've seen as a challenge is that even when you've done that, right, you've got this, you got in a data warehouse, the goal isn't the centralization of the data, right? The goal is, how do I let my BDRs create better outreach plans? How do my SDRs prepare for a demo? How does an account exec, use this information to prepare them or so help them move an account along, your funnel or your buying process, right? How does a CSM get ready for a QBR and EBR, right? So there's a big gap we've seen between here and the actions that customers need to take on this data. Doug, you've been kind of talking about this a lot internally. Like, what are some of your thoughts on the actions they want to take and the gap you're seeing there for customers with this data?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that I think, so this has been a feature we've had under beta now for a few weeks. And Eric invariably is in our one-on-ones to be like, have you seen this feature? And I'll go nuts for the weekend. So thanks for all the ruined weekends, Eric. But the one thing that didn't wasn't obvious to me out of the gate about having this combination of AI and intent, in this case the AI summary within our engagement module, the thing that I didn't realize was just how powerful this is in combination with other other applications in CaliberMind. And I'll give you a very recent example, which was we were seeing a choke point in our funnels application where we're getting a huge amount of automatically qualified accounts, and they weren't translating into MQA. And what I was able to do is take that AI summary and go back to the sellers and go through and take a look at accounts that hadn't sort of made that leap. And so what it turned into was a diagnostic tool. And so this is really what you're speaking to, Eric. So think about that, like, leader of marketing is able to use it as a diagnostic. Think about how powerful that is for a seller, or think about how powerful that is for a sales manager who's trying to understand why a deal isn't advancing.
Yeah.
And back to the BI layer on top of the data warehouses, you just don't have the ability to sort of diagnose in the way that you need to. And frankly, at the end of the day, I see this as being a tool that extends not just into the marketing ops area or into the marketing area, but I think it's going to be a huge tool for sellers going forward.
Yeah.
And Doug, prior to this, the motion would have been probably maybe reaching out to our team and saying, hey folks, can we please, for these set of accounts, can we please pull in the data and do analysis, likely through SQL of some way as to the patterns, which I think shows to the extra resources that need to be involved in such a process, right? In order to get to the same data, to the same output.
That is spot on. But what you just talked about, Misha, there are so many human steps from the point you think you have a problem to your ability to diagnose. So that could include calling the person who administers the BI application and then giving them requirements, and then they come back and tell you there's a data key. Then they give me the data, and I don't want to go through it because we've all been in that place before. And then by the time you get in front of the sellers or whoever you're doing the diagnostic with, you don't have the data you need. And if you do have the data you need, you're a week away.
Yeah.
And that sounds lightning fast, but in today's intensely competitive environment in SaaS, like, you want to make these decisions in days because it's going to take you, a week or two to implement a change. And so it's to me, as I look at it, I go, we can move quickly and break stuff much more quickly than competitors who don't have this capability can do.
Yeah, but I also want to kind of focus on, and that's really helpful for the CMO and the marketing part of the organization. But at the end of the day, it's marketing's job to also translate those buyer journeys out to the rest of the organization in a way that they can use, right? Because if you think about it, marketing, if marketing is truly becoming the owner of these buyer journeys, and they really are, because most of these data sources, a lot of these data sources are under they're under marketing's kind of purview, right? Some of it is coming from the CRM and these other applications, but it's really marketing's job to understand how things are moving through. But like, how do you translate that out, right? And we showed what you really want to do is be able to take that data and get it into a summarization format that's really helpful for them. But that going from this data warehouse to that is really difficult. And to kind of show you what it takes, like first you have to take all that data and you have to your point, Misha, get it into a consolidated data set, like a real marketing data warehouse. A data warehouse is not necessarily a marketing data warehouse because you got to get that, it's got to be stitched, fixed, deduped, anonymous data has to be matched in, you got to blend the data together, you got to like all the stuff has to happen. Then you have buyer journeys. But even after you do all of that, right, you still have these tables of buyer journeys, right? Maybe some neat graphics, but that's still not something these teams out here can really use. What I think the next layer is on top of this is you have to be able to summarize this data. But that means you have to create very bespoke, you have to figure out like what prompts, what information, like you want to send it off to Gemini or ChatGPT or Claude or whatever. First, you have to have all this stuff working, right? Then you have to be able to figure out what are the prompts? How do I feature engineer and prompt engineer this data into this to create these actionable responses, right? But once you do all this, that's when you can come up with these summarized data and summarized information.
I would just even say that somewhere between the consolidated data and the LLM environment, there might even need to be, before even the prompt engineering of the underlying data that would be fed into it, because it is very likely that even in a consolidated data environment, you do not have all the signals or all of the characteristics that would make the prompt be useful as part of the event data. So there is potentially even an additional step that actually joins tables together in order to have enough meaningful data for the prompt to give you a useful summary of the buyer journey.
Right, which gets to underlying this, it's Google and a lot of these organizations, a lot of the architecture is called the RAG architecture, right? How do I take data and then use the prompts on it to feed this information in to get good responses back, right? And everyone's like, oh, you just take this data from these databases and shove it in here. But you can't really do that, right? You have to create to some extent, either using a super geeky vector database or something like that. But you got to really engineer your data to be able to feed into these things in a way that they can then leverage and use. Right? You got to be able to match up, like I've got all this data and I got to get it into a format that when I feed it to this prompt, I'm getting meaningful results out here. Otherwise, you just sort of get random noise, to be honest, right? That's where these things kind of get really difficult and really hard. And at the course at the end of this, you want to get back to, boom, like, this is how, because at the end of it, you want to be like, okay, now with this, a BDR can scan through here and create an outreach plan, right? The SDR can prepare for their demo. Like, this is what they need to be able to prepare. And then we've got customers that are even saying like, hey, I want to take this and auto-generate an email out of it. Like, I want to take this and then feed it back into some other information and auto-generate outbound content. A little bit past the purview of what we feel like our application does, but that's what we're actually seeing as customers want to do. But you can only do that because you've gotten here.
And if I can, I want to take a pause here. And the reason I want to take a pause is I think it's 3 or 4 years ago now where Gartner came out with this stat that sort of blew people's minds. And my recall is that it said that 56% of the buyer's journey occurs outside of the view or out of the control of the seller, right? 3 or 4 years ago. They recently came back out and said that's now up to 81%.
Wow.
And so what's happening is increasingly, as Eric spoke to, what's happening increasingly is that marketing organizations are owning the buyer's journey.
Mm-hmm.
But the buyer's journey doesn't always end up in a thing that the sellers need. That thing in, say, our case would be, hey, I'd love to see your product, right?
Yeah.
And quite often what's happening as we look at these journeys is you can see them sort of branching in their decision making. This is how spooky
Yeah.
this is, right? We can see them looking at alternatives and
Mhm.
going, oh, here's what I'm going to potentially pick. We know this from G2 data, right? And so we may own the buying process, but we need to be able to partner with the sellers, or the buyer journey rather. We have to partner with sellers and be like, this is the moment you need to be involved. And so what we'll do is we'll deploy paid social activity to sort of warm
Yeah.
up the account, and the sellers will go in. Well, guess what? If marketing's not on top of that data in partnership with the sellers, the BDRs, the SDRs, the account
Yeah.
execs, if we're not in partnership, we're missing out on deals. And
Mhm.
that's really what it's gotten to, like the syncopation level that if we told somebody 4 years ago this is how we would be capturing deal cycles, they would have been like, no way, that's not possible. So not only is it necessary, but now with AI summaries, it's entirely possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, go and let's kind of get back to bridging the gap between intent data plus first party data, all the data sources, and actionable things that help these teams. There's a lot of steps, there's a lot of things that need to come together, right? But when you do that, when you do the work and you put it in a data warehouse, and or you source it into a marketing data warehouse, and then you synthesize and integrate that data together and put in the rules and things that dedupe and stitch and do all that work, right? And then you have good prompt engineering and good architecture that can take the data out of the data warehouses and put it into a format that can be leveraged by these tools. Suddenly you can go from sort of intent plus first party data to, at the end of the day, what the organization really wants, which is efficient use of that information by the right team at the right time to drive results. Because at the end of the day, like, nobody cares. Like, putting this all in a data warehouse, who cares? That doesn't help me. Like, what I need that data to drive efficiency and results by my teams. And often those teams, you got marketing kind of owning this, but those teams are BDRs and SDRs and account execs and CSMs, because there's the ones at the end of the day that are really doing this outreach. And then marketing, probably should have a marketing bullet up here. They use this information for diagnostics and also figuring out outbound motions and ad copy and all these things, so they can see what's going on in these buyer journeys also.
Yeah, and I'm Eric. I know I'm the one who's sort of singing the praises of this for the sellers, but let's sit for a moment on this idea of what this means to marketing organizations. And I will
Yeah.
say that the amount of pipeline we're creating in partnership with our sellers at CaliberMind, given the size of our organization and our spend, is just crazy. And I would say it's this having this type of data at the ready at all times that allows us to make just much better. And sometimes it's not even better decisions, it's faster decisions and
That's
apply
right.
them really quickly.
Yeah.
And we're talking about sort of the architecture of how to get there. And it just still kills me to this day. And we know this is a pretty accurate number. About 90% of the market decides to build their own stuff. And every time I see us roll out a new feature like this, I'm like, why? Why would you do this? Why would you miss out on these opportunities? And then I would come back to, hey, we're much more efficient because we have the data. We're much more efficient because we're able to summarize it and we're able to act on it. And we have a tiny little team and we're out there kicking your butts in terms of productivity, folks. So if you don't have this application, if you don't have something like this, you're really missing out. You're overspending.
Yeah. Yeah. Misha, any final words on what you're seeing out there?
I feel like you said, I really like your comment that at the end of the day, data is a means to an end, but at the end of the day, it's presenting to executives proper next steps. It's having quick tactical motions or insights into next motions. And this notion of I think a really successful company will take a really difficult problem and make it be really simple. And I think the output of this is incredibly simple. Of course, the underlying steps, it requires a data warehouse, a marketing data warehouse, a lot of good marketing assumptions, a lot of good data manipulation. But the output of it, which is really the ultimate utility here, is hopefully everyone can agree is a very tangible and a very simple way to quickly grasp a buyer journey and take proper next steps with it.
Great. I think we're at time here. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. That wraps things for this week's Funnel Lab Friday. Next week, we're going to be back with Raja Walia of GNW Consulting, an organization that we work very closely with here at CaliberMind. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.